probably people on Facebook and YouTube also. Stacy, welcome. Lauren, Barbara, thank you guys. Give it another couple minutes. I have to sneeze. I'm going to mute.
That's right.
Thanks. Oh,
Listen,
didn't happen. Didn't happen. False alarm. Hi, Carol. Let's all turn on our cameras if we can. You don't have to, but if you can. David, I had a good chat with your brother-in-law. He's got his hands full there.
Sure, start.
Yeah, unmute it. Yeah.
he enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
I didn't feel great delivering the news, but I think it's more of a bankruptcy than a turnaround situation, but he would know better.
No, it's really interesting. He recounted to me. I thought it was great. Thank you for talking.
Of course.
He's a smart guy, and you were.
Oh, yeah. He is. That's for sure. That's for sure. Hi, Ken. Hi, Carol. Have you guys, I don't know if you guys have seen this show. I watched it with Betsy last night, one episode. Hi, Stacy, called Upload. And it's about an idyllic afterlife, which I'm guessing as the series progresses, turns out not to be not so idyllic. But Ken, your background looks like a scene from Upload. It's a very interesting, well, the first episode was interesting. I don't know how the whole thing's going to be, but we shall see.
It could be an idea for a sermon.
Yeah, I want to see how it plays out, but it's pretty interesting. I think the whole phenomenon of all these afterlife shows coming out now says a lot about what was on people's minds during the pandemic, because there are a lot of them. And I think there's a correlation. I can't prove it, but I think there is. I'm not really a TV person, but I know there's a lot of afterlife movies and TV series out there now. And I think the pandemic is influential in that, but not really my world. Okay, guys, we are going to begin. Let me just see what time it is. So come on, 12:04. Yeah, okay. If you're 4 minutes late on Zoom, you're really late. All right, so here we go, everyone. Thanks for being here. I've got to let a few more people in. Sorry. Admit all. Come on in, everyone. Just waiting for Ivan.
Morning, Steve. Good afternoon.
Hi, Karen. Good morning.
How are you?
Good afternoon.
Happy
guess-
afternoon to you too.
Yeah.
Life is not simple, is it?
No.
But
No.
then, what would we do
No.
with a little simplicity?
Yeah, Betsy grew up in a county in Indiana that does not observe daylight savings time. So sometimes it's 2 hours later there, and sometimes it's 3 hours later there, and it's just crazy. I never know what time it is where she grew up. Okay. All right. So let's jump in. For those of you who have a book with you, a Tanakh or Torah, Leviticus chapter 12. We're going to start right at the beginning of chapter 12. For those of you who are Googling it on an iPad or phone, Leviticus chapter 12. And okay, so what?
We have the same Bible. We have the same Bible you use.
Okay, good. All right, so
Religion too.
let's all right, let's just get a bit of the text underneath us. There's a lot of there. It's not exactly repetitious, but the entire Parsha is pretty similar. So we're not going to read the whole thing before we start talking about it. So let's jump in. Okay, Marty, you want to read for us?
Fine.
Okay, chapter 12, verse 1, Leviticus.
Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, Speak to the Israelite people thus. When a woman at childbirth bears a male, she shall be unclean 7 days. She shall be unclean as at the time of her menstrual infirmity.
Okay.
On
All
the-
right. So let's stop there
Okay.
because this gives me an opportunity to talk about the difficulty with translation and why unclean is not the right word. Okay. And this is going to be a setup for much of what we're going to be talking about today. So here's the conundrum that the rabbis wrestle with. The first commandment in the Torah, the first thou shalt in the entire Torah is pru or vu. Be fruitful and multiply.
Not eating.
Okay, Barbara, mute over there. Marty. The first commandment in the Torah, book of Genesis, God says to humankind, pru or vu. It's an imperative. Be fruitful and multiply. Go have babies. Okay? By the way, this is particularly important for Jews now because the birth rate for Jews in America is 1.7 per couple, and replacement rate is 2.1. So we're not even replacing ourselves anymore, let alone growing. All right. So that is a commandment from God. And now what do we learn? That when a woman fulfills that commandment, she is considered, and I quote in the English, unclean, which is a pretty hard circle to square or square to circle, right? Any ideas? Any ideas? Yeah, Sukasa, go ahead, unmute.
Well, didn't they see the ancients see blood as like when you think of kashrut laws, you have to drain the blood, and one of the plagues was blood. So I don't know how to describe what they felt about blood, but it wasn't good.
Right, blood is powerful. Blood is life, is how the Torah puts it in 5 different places. Blood is life. We're not allowed to ingest blood. There's sprinkling of blood as a sacrifice on the altar, animal blood, of course. But we are also considered tameh or unclean in other circumstances, by the way. Men who have a nocturnal emission are considered unclean. This is just a totally normal, natural thing to happen to some men at some point. And it just doesn't seem to make sense how fulfilling a mitzvah or just being human could make us unclean. I'll give you another example. Caring for the dead by washing the body and preparing it for burial is a mitzvah, a commandment, a righteous deed. In fact, it's a high order of magnitude of mitzvah because it's in this category of commandments that are particularly honorable because they can't be repaid by the recipient. It's completely selfless. And a person who touches a corpse is also considered by the Torah to be tameh, to be unclean. And this too is a mitzvah. It's a commandment. Why am I pointing this out? Because unclean doesn't mean dirty in the Torah context. When we say unclean, we tend to think, because of the translation, dirty. Impure is another way this is often translated. The opposite of pure. Now, so let's see if we can find a common denominator in the examples that I have given us to figure out in the biblical context, in the Jewish psyche, what does it mean to be tameh, to be impure, unclean? And can we come up with a better translation? Panina, go ahead. Make sure you unmute.
I have a feeling that it's the same idea that happened when they said that certain people had leprosy. I think
Well, that's where we're heading. So what do you mean?
I think that it was actually an amazing insight of people actually living and seeing What is it that will hurt them or affect them? And we think always that because they were in the desert and because all whatever things will happen to them, they weren't sophisticated enough to understand that certain things were not good, because the 10 Commandments were not given to them the first day that they were there. The 10 Commandments were given to them after a while.
Okay.
And the whole idea was that the recognition of cause and effect was actually tested by them before the 10 Commandments came. So
Yes.
the 10 Commandments was a result of that thing, of test and effect.
Right.
So I think the whole idea with the blood that might have a connection with people getting sick or people getting poisoning when they eat something old or dead, things like that. I think it was recognized
Right.
as a pattern and then was decided to be a law.
Right. So let's see what it is the Torah was recognizing when it said that people who gave birth, handled a corpse. We're going to get to leprosy in a moment, which of course wasn't leprosy, but it's definitely a skin disease, an affliction, a visible affliction. What did it mean from the Torah's point of view that a person was tameh or unclean? Brad, go ahead. You're unmuted. Go ahead.
Well, I always thought it was meant to say that that person was impure ritually and not physically.
Right, but what does that even mean? Why would a person be impure ritually if they performed a mitzvah? Okay, let me
Well, I mean, they could still be, that's not denying that what they did was not a wonderful thing, but according to the rules, they were still considered to be impure in order to perform a ritual function.
Why?
Good question.
Cindy, go ahead.
Well, only I use the women's commentary, and it does use impure instead of unclean.
Right.
But being unclean requires separation, and in the case of childbirth, this built in a time for the mother to rest and attend to her child.
Right, because what's being addressed, if we can use this as a transition to at least what I think is going on here, because the Torah is talking about a person's spiritual state. And I would not use the word impure, and I would not use the word unclean if I could translate Torah for tameh or tuma. I would use a phrase. The phrase I would use is emotionally out of balance.
Okay.
Right? Because for any of you who have given birth, it's a pretty powerful experience. For any of you who have witnessed the birth of a child, it's a pretty life-altering, powerful experience. For any of you that have seen, touched, handled a dead body, it is a very powerful, spiritual, surreal experience, right? For any of us who, and I'm going to save my next example for later when we get to this leprosy section. And I agree essentially with what Penina has said, which is our ancestors were keenly aware of the kinds of experiences that really threw people, that really changed people's reality in a very powerful way. And I'll give you one simple example from my life. I have stood next to families grieving and walked them up to look at their loved one's body in a casket more than 1,000 times, many more than 1,000 times. And I stand right there with them. And to be honest with you, while I feel for them, of course, it doesn't affect me very much. I have like this distance, this shard of ice in me that enables me to do my job. You know, Graham Greene said the difference between a writer and everyone else is that when chaos comes, the writer has a shard of ice in him that allows him to take notes, right? I have that shard of ice when I'm standing with people next to the body of their loved one. I have to, and it's not my loved one. When I was looking into the casket we don't have open caskets, Gabe, but we view before the burial and then the casket is closed, okay, for those who wish to do so. When I was standing over my father's casket looking at his body, it was a transformative experience for me. And it took me years to decompress and to integrate that into my life. Years. I was unbalanced. I was spiritually rocked. And I was in no condition to be the rabbi in that moment, to Brad's point. I was the son. And I think that our ancestors were more keenly aware of the effect that being in touch with the power of life and death has on people than we are. And remember, I mean, we know this, but childbirth back then, it wasn't like there was no epidural and crushed ice and Netflix. You know, it was raw. And death was raw. There was no van that showed up from Hillside and whisked the body away, and then you saw it again when it was in a casket, prettified, you know, with a suit and tie or a pretty dress and makeup. It wasn't like that. Embalming didn't really exist. There was mummification, but embalming in Western civilization, and particularly in America, came about during the Civil War, because it was the first time that soldiers died so far from home, and they needed a way to get the bodies back to their families. And so embalming took off at that point. There were even embalmers who traveled to each battlefield and set up their tents to advertise their services. So back then, people were even more proximate and close to these life-altering experiences. And the Torah is sensitive to that. People need time. And they unclean does not mean dirty. It means profoundly affected in a spiritual sense.
And physical.
And sometimes physical, but sometimes not. And I think this is a very important insight for us today when we're dealing with others who are being rocked by some profound life force kind of event, and when we're having our own internal conversation about our own powerful, not necessarily negative, but powerful encounters with life and death. So that's kind of, that's a setting of the table for what we're going to do next. And I just want to read, okay. Any questions or comments, please feel free to raise your hand and unmute, or are we there? I think we've made the point pretty well, right? Okay. All right, so let's now, well, I actually have a question. Let's just spend a minute on this, okay? A minute or two. Is there anybody willing to share an experience that did put them in this kind of surreal spiritual realm that required time for re-entry? Anybody willing to share? Because I don't think childbirth and death are the only ones. Yeah, Stacy, go ahead. Unmute though.
I can relate to what you said about seeing your dad in the casket, because I had to do that too. And it was like 2015. And at that time, I thought that Jews didn't ever have open caskets. And I actually went, to see my dad in the casket, and it was a freaky experience. I mean, I don't mean to make that sound kind of frivolous.
I think any of us who've done it understand. I think we understand what you mean, and you can't just go right from that to, I got to get back to work. Let's deal with this open casket issue. Jews do not have open caskets at funerals. However, an hour before, any family that wish to view are allowed to do so. And in fact, some cemeteries, not all, actually require a family member to view to make sure that they're never putting the wrong body in the wrong burial site. In my 35 years as a rabbi, that's happened twice.
Oh my God.
Oh my God.
And it is an incredibly painful experience for the family, because then you have to do an exhumation and move, and it's terrible. So that's one pragmatic reason why some cemeteries have this policy. Karen, unmute.
I'd like to say that I was catatonic at 9/11.
Aha. Yes.
Being a New Yorker, being a Manhattanite, having an understanding of what those buildings were filled with,
Yes.
watching people literally flung to their deaths because of a situation. It's very powerful. I still feel it.
Yes. 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 Yes, I think the entire nation was unbalanced, right? Thrown out of sorts. And it lasted a long time.
Yeah.
Okay, Sukasa, and then Carol, and then Doug. Go ahead, Sukasa.
The assassination of John Kennedy. I remember now exactly where I was standing and the reaction I had. I can feel it again.
Mm-hmm. Carol, go ahead, unmute.
I have that experience and recollection, Susan, too. It's visceral. It's an imprint forever. It's a death of a kind when relationships that really matter end.
Yeah.
And if it's unexpected and sudden, it's been my experience in the past and recently, to use an English expression, I'm upended. I'm at 6s and 7s. My priorities are confused. I'm unavailable to titrate, to prioritize, to stay in balance. My thoughts are unavailable to me. My bag of tools doesn't work for that kind of situation, and I have to reset. It may take me more than a day. It may take me a while, and then the recovery and processing and all that. But seriously, at the beginning, it's a jolt that's emotional, spiritual. And as I get older, with stress and anxiety affecting one's body,
Yeah.
It's powerful, as you say. It's very powerful.
Yeah. Okay, one more from Doug, and then I want to move to the next half of the Parsha. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, thank you. One of the most traumatic experiences of my life was when my ex-wife said she wanted a divorce. I was blindsided, and it took a long time. And I remember just sitting in the chair and breaking out crying, and it was bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm generalizing. I'm definitely generalizing here, but my experience, anecdotal as it may be, with couples who are getting divorced, is that most men, let me put it differently, most women have decided to end the marriage a year or more before they inform their husband. And so the shock to the husband is far greater than to the wife, who has come to the conclusion long before that the marriage is dying or dead. And, this is exacerbated by family law attorneys who say Don't say a word. Don't tell him anything. Invite him to a public place, and we'll have him served there. And it adds to the surreal nature of the information and the pain and the power of it all. So, all right, now I'm going to Brad.
Rabbi,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I just want to say I'm finding it troubling that at this time of when your emotions are heightened, that you're excluded. This seems to be a time when you should be included.
Okay, so let's
something seems very wrong here.
Well, let's get into that, because I think it's a perfect segue to the next half of the Parsha. Okay, I'd like to just read a little of the text, and then we're going to get to your question of exclusion versus inclusion, because I think that I think I know there's more to it than kind of meets the eye on the first pass here. So let's jump ahead, and frankly, it doesn't much matter how far we jump ahead. Okay, let's. I'm trying to find kind of the least gross section here. Okay, let's go. There's no way out of this. Let's go to 13:1, and we're gonna read through 13:8. Okay, Marty, help us out. 13:1 to 13:8 for those of you who are following along. Go ahead, Marty.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has the skin of his body swelling, a rash, or discoloration, and it develops into a scaly affection on the skin of his body, it shall be reported to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons, the
priest.
The priest. The priest.
Okay, so let's just start there. This is an indication that it's perceived not only as a physical ailment, but a spiritual ailment. Because who's doing the diagnosing here? The chief religious functionary, the chief spiritual officer, so to speak, of the Jewish people. Right? It's not called the shaman. It's not called the doctor. It's called the priest, because this is being framed as a mind-body issue and as a spiritual disorder. Let's just get through the text, and then we'll take some comments and talk about it. Go ahead, Marty.
All right. The priest shall examine the affection of the skin of his body. If the hair of the affected patch has turned white and the affection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a leprous affection. When the priest sees it, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if it is a white discoloration on the skin of his body, which does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair on it has not turned white, the priest shall isolate the affected person for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest shall examine him, and if the affection has remained unchanged, the color and the disease have not spread on the skin, the priest shall isolate him for another 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest shall examine him again. If the affection has faded and has not spread to the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean.
Okay, let's stop there. Now, I just want to make a couple of general points about this, and then we're going to get into sort of Brad's concern about isolation, right? And you know, we have all just lived through, and I suspect we'll be living through again to some degree, this fear of transmission, this fear of contamination. It's easy to forget, but you remember when we were all wiping down everything, when you couldn't find bleach anywhere, you couldn't find hand sanitizer anywhere. Healthcare workers were taking their clothes off outside and then coming in and showering and then putting on clean clothes before engaging with their family. Mm-hmm. Remember walking down the street, or when you had to go to the grocery store, how afraid you were of a person who you thought might be afflicted. So let's try to understand the ethos. Okay, number one. Number two, I don't know how many people on this Zoom have suffered from some kind of visible affliction. Shaved head, a woman with a shaved head, obviously due to chemotherapy. Somebody with severe eczema, as an example. We had someone who works for the temple pass out and fall on her face, and she's bruised everywhere. What does it feel like to be a walking spectacle? How does it feel to be stared at, to obviously see that people are afraid to approach you, afraid of you, afraid that what you have might be communicable?
A pariah.
A pariah. And so isolation, and we're going to get to what it doesn't mean, but isolation does give people the opportunity to think and to heal. You can think of Shiva as a kind of isolation. You don't go out, you limit your activities, people don't talk to you unless you talk to them. So isolation can cut two ways. It can be a very sensitive kind of runway to give people emotionally to land after what they've been through. I will tell you that after my dad died, I appreciated every email, but the ones I appreciated the most were the ones that started with, "I do not expect you to answer this." Those were a blessing to me. And I know that it was sincere. Like, I am reaching out to let you know I care, but I want to leave you alone. Same thing when the congregation found out my mother had COVID. I said, please, I know you care, but please don't email me. I just, so I think that Brad, there's another side to this isolation issue, but now let's look at another aspect, which is that, okay, the person was quarantined for 7 days, right? And then checked, and then if necessary, another 7 days. Here's the interesting thing. When a person was afflicted, the camp did not move on without them. Remember, our ancestors were moving through the desert for 40 years. Encamped and moving, camping, moving, camping, moving. When someone was afflicted with an illness that made them emotionally or physically out of sorts, everyone hunkered down and stayed put. Oh. It was you go there, you heal, we're not going anywhere. And the rabbi's going to check on you on the community's behalf. So, and remember, this is before the era of obviously Zoom and FaceTime and anything else, including gloves and masks and gowns, right? There was no way to protect yourself. Okay, so I don't think, Brad, it's quite as inhumane or cruel as it seems on the surface and as it would be in a contemporary context, right? The whole community stopped and waited until the person could heal. No ill person left behind, to kind of paraphrase the Marines, right? Okay, Penina, go ahead.
Okay, this was a very good example. And also what happened with the COVID is another good example. But let's go back to where it was, where the priest was the one who actually gave the signals.
Right.
It's because every time that there was a ritual behavior or event, the whole purpose was to gather the people together, to have them there. The priest didn't go there by himself, and the other people decided they're going to come there later, a week or a month later, whenever they feel like it or they have the time. It was the whole idea was to create a nation, to have them together. So the fact that they didn't leave, yes, that's true. But also, if the priest was affected by the disease, the people are there.
Yeah, there were
event.
There were
the same threat as anybody else to the welfare of everybody.
Yes, so, there were pragmatic. Yeah. There were pragmatic and spiritual considerations. Right now, I want to make one more point, and then I want to jump to a very important mitzvah, and we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about that. The next point I want to make is this tzara'at or tazria is a name for a category of diseases. You know, I often have to remind people that cancer is a word for many different diseases. This is very important for children to understand. When someone they know dies of cancer, they need to know that cancer is a word for many different diseases. And the spot that Daddy has right here on his head is not the same disease as the disease that Uncle Maury died from, okay? This is not pancreatic cancer. They're different diseases. So tzaraat is a category of diseases that all have to do with some kind of infection, of skin affliction, some kind of visible building. I mean, there's also another sort of subset of these diseases called a nega, which means plague. For example, mold in a building is kind of under this umbrella of afflictions. So that's important to understand. Now, I want to talk about the priest and the visiting and talk about an entire world of mitzvot, world of commandments that come from this original concept of being sensitive to people who are ill, who are spiritually imbalanced. By the way, this whitening of the skin was a disease that the rabbi said happened because of gossip. When Moses doubted God's power, God said, put your hand in your vest, and he did, and it came out white with this disease. When Miriam and Aaron were gossiping about Moses's wife, the Cushite, because she was African, they were afflicted with this disease. So there's a mind-body connection here that was very real for our ancestors that, to be honest with you, I used to dismiss, but I do no longer because I've experienced it myself. Now, this leads to a whole universe of mitzvot, of commandments, called Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick. What is the guidance from the rabbis about visiting the sick? And there's and Talmud, rabbinic literature, contemporary rabbinic literature is, I like that Brene Brown quote. Yeah, we don't turn away, right? All right. It's a different perspective, but it's really about the person's dignity. Gay, I think is her point. You know, don't let it define them, but how it feels to the person, I think, is a very different experience to the afflicted person. And I don't know that I like her a lot, and I like her work a lot, and I'd give my right arm to be on her podcast when my new book comes out. But I don't think she fully appreciates the perspective of the afflicted in this regard. Okay, back to business. What are the guidances? What is the guidance? What are the rules? What are the laws when it comes to visiting the sick? And I want to run through a bunch of them now. And in the hopes that they will really help all of us, because all of us know people who are going to need us, who are going to feel isolated. I would say the common denominator of illness, mental or physical, that I hear from people, the real pain of it is most times the greatest from the feeling of isolation, from the feeling of abandonment, from the feeling of being forgotten, from the feeling of being in it alone. It's worse than the physical pain. And how we pierce that sense of abandonment and isolation is by following some of these guidelines given to us by the rabbis, as long as 2,000 years ago. What do we do when we visit the sick? The first thing I'll tell you is that visiting the sick is considered by the Talmud incredibly meritorious. The Talmud says that when we visit the sick, get this, we remove 1/60th of their disease. Now, I was a smartass in rabbinical school, and I asked our Talmud professor, Jacob Petachovsky, if I visited 60 times, would the person be cured? And he was not amused. But so it's collectively visitation. It all helps, and visiting helps 1/60th. Okay, so I still remember the look on his face when I asked that question. It was not my finest hour. Okay, so first of all, keep the visit short. The rabbis literally say when you visit the sick, you have to keep your visit short so you don't add to their exhaustion and add to their affliction. Keep it short. Don't park yourself there with a magazine, and some snacks and the remote like you're in a hotel room somewhere on vacation. Don't do that. Okay? People are often physically vulnerable. They don't look their best. They don't feel their best. Parts of their body are exposed in ways that they're not comfortable with. So keep it short. Number one. Number two, not everyone should or can receive visitors physically. So you need to ask. You don't just drop in. Would you like to visit? May I visit? And if the patient is in no condition to answer that question, the rabbis say you ask family. Would it be okay if I go? Would you ask her if she would like a visit? Okay, even Samantha, when I hear about people who are ill and in the hospital, I ask her to ask, would it be okay if Rabbi Leder comes to visit? And you have to respect the patient. Now, the Talmud literally says you have to enter the room of the sick person in a positive mood. Now, this I learned from my friend Ronnie Friedman, a rabbi in Boston whose son Jesse died by suicide many years ago. And after that experience, I asked Ronnie, what did you learn that you didn't know? What did you learn as the father of someone who died by suicide that the rabbi didn't know? And he said, well, this is going to surprise you, but one of the things I learned is that most people showed up with a persona different than their true selves. They walked into the room with this long, sad, oh, Ronnie, this is the worst possible thing ever I'm so sorry. And he said, that was not helpful. I wanted people to be who they were with me in life when they were with me in death. Authenticity. If I had to put it in 4 words, if I had to distill all of this, I would say, show up, be yourself. If you're a joker, joke. If you're a feeder, feed. If you're a hugger, hug. If you're, if you're an errand runner, run errands. Whatever it is life affirming when the person who shows up when you're suffering is the same person you've always known, because the opposite gives you this feeling that the bottom has fallen out of the world. If this has changed, everything has changed. So when you show up, just be you, right? From studying with me all these years, I have a joke to illustrate almost every point imaginable in the human experience. I tell them in the hospital, I leave them laughing because that's Steve. I don't walk in with this, oh my God, this is So that's part of it. You got to enter as who you are. Unless you're sort of an eternally depressed person, then I would say maybe a phone call. Okay. I could go on about that, but that makes the point. Be a positive person when you come in, even if the person's terminal. I still tell a joke. And do not be the bearer of bad news. Do not bring negative tidings, okay, to this person who's in the hospital or at home suffering. You don't need to walk in the door and say, "Oh my God, did you hear about, did you hear about, I don't know, the plane that crashed and all those dead people? Isn't that awful? No, did you hear about the divorce and the girlfriend and the this? Did you hear?" Don't do that. Don't bring bad news to a person who's ill and suffering. If they hear it, they hear it. If they raise it, they raise it, but they don't need to hear it from you, and you don't need to raise it with them. Try to help in 3 ways. This is from Yeshayahu Horowitz, Rabbi Horowitz, who's done a lot of work in this field. And the way he puts it is with your body. That's one way. And with your body, he means physically showing up and visiting. He means, you know what nurses are like these days, how overworked they are. He means, hey, do you want me to get you another pillow? You want me to get you a blanket? You want me to put your bed up? You want me to clear that tray away? You want me to walk you to the bathroom? You want to go for a walk in the hallway? Physically, with your body, show up and physically help. You want me to go get your mail at the house and bring it to you? Can I go across the street and pick up some decent food? Because the food sucks in this hospital. There's no such thing as good hospital food. There's just bad and worse. Right? So, can I go, you want some, can I go to Big Chill and bring you some ice cream to UCLA? Or physically help. Number 1. Second, with your soul. We've talked about with your body. Second, with your soul. Attend to the person's spiritual needs. Can I ask the chaplain to bring the electric Shabbat candles for you? And we'll turn them on together and say the blessing together. It's Rosh Hashanah. Do you want to do Kiddush? I'm going to say a Misha Berach for you at temple tonight. I'm going to call the rabbi and ask him or her to do it. I'm praying for you. These things matter. And this is where many Reformed Jews become uncomfortable because they feel like it sounds Christian. It's not. The Misha Berach is as Jewish as it gets. Praying for another person is as Jewish as it gets. And I remember the first time I went public about my father's Alzheimer's. It was a long time ago because he had it for 10 years and he died almost 5 years ago, or 4.5. Mm-hmm. And my friend Tavis, who's African-American and Southern Baptist, he called me and he said, I just want you to know I said a prayer for your dad today in church. I was deeply moved. It really helps to know that we're being prayed for when we're suffering, and it really helps us to pray for someone when that someone we love is suffering. So body and soul, okay, guf and nefesh, and finally mammon, with our material wealth, with money, to help people financially when they're ill. The financial ramifications of illness are wide and deep. People who can't work. People can't afford their medical bills. People can't afford the help they need when they get home. People can't afford the equipment they need when they get home. And on and on. People can't afford the Uber that they have to have now because they can't drive for the next 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 3 weeks, or the rest of their lives. So this, Dana, I'll get to you in 1 second. This is another very real and tangible way that the rabbis say, this is what it means to show up. It's not just show up physically, although that's extremely important. And it's not just to show up spiritually, although that's extremely important. And it's not just to show up financially, although that's extremely important. It's to show up all three ways. Okay, Dana, go ahead.
I remember a story that was told in the Temple Bulletin. Maybe you remember as well. I don't remember who the author was, but it was a congregant who saw his former hairdresser at the food pantry. And the person was all like disheveled and sick. The person had AIDS. And at one time, the person had been a celebrated Beverly Hills hairdresser, with a line of customers out the door. And when the person got sick, nobody was to be found anywhere. And the person ended up in the food pantry with AIDS and sick and no income and totally forgotten. And I mean, that story could have been in the Temple Bulletin 20 years ago. I don't know, but it was a very moving story.
Yeah. I mean, it was, the real height of the AIDS crisis was late 80s, early to mid 90s. So yeah, probably 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Right. So the ramifications of illness, look, we've all been through it as a nation and we're suffering with it today because of COVID. I mean, what that disease did, the ways in which it devastated families and societies. So 1 million people roughly have died of COVID in America, and they estimate that those deaths intimately affected 9 other people for each person. So we're talking about 9 million people affected by this disease, on top of the way it affected all of us, our children and our grandchildren. And, what is the tail of being locked up? How long is the tail of what we've all been through? So, what did it do to my mother that none of her 5 children could hug her for more than 2 years because she's in a nursing home? Okay, point made. Let's go through a few more. Okay, there's no limit to the amount of times that one can fulfill this commandment to visit the sick. Now, remember, we don't want to become a burden or a problem for the sick. Visits should be short, but going once doesn't necessarily mean you've moved the needle very much. Okay? If you can't go, things like FaceTime, Zoom, phone calls are also extremely, extremely important, even if your call is not returned. If this is an interesting one, but this actually happens to me sometimes when I'm making the rounds at Cedars or UCLA and I'm running out of time. Because you never know when you walk in the room how long you're going to be there when you're visiting in my capacity, right? Sometimes people want to talk about their funeral, and sometimes people are just, Rabbi, thank you for coming. I'm so tired. Please forgive me. I appreciate that you stopped by. Sometimes it's a 30-second visit, and sometimes it's a 30-minute visit. And I have a list of people to see, and I'm running out of time, and I can't see them all, and I have to decide who to see. The rabbis here again, they instruct us, and they say you should visit the person likely to be visited the least, if at all, who's on your list. Now, back 2,000 years ago, this had to do also with distance to travel and things like that. Like, I can't see them both. What do? You see the person who you expect to receive the fewest, if any, visitors. I don't know why you would ever be in that situation, but it's possible that you would be. I'm in it, frequently. Now, what about a person you don't like? Because the rabbis considered this also. What about the person you don't like, but you've heard that person is ill? And you really don't like that person. Should you visit?
Yes.
Should you call?
Yes.
Should you send a note? Should you send flowers? Well, not necessarily, yes. Because remember, the perspective we want to privilege above all others is the perspective of the afflicted, which is gay, why I don't agree with Brene Brown. But don't tell her, because I'd give my right arm to be on her podcast. Okay. the perspective of the afflicted is the perspective we need to consider. So if someone you really dislike is ill, we are instructed by the rabbis to ask a third party, to ask the afflicted if he or she would appreciate a visit from the person with whom they do not necessarily get along. Now, this might seem like, oh, that's silly and funny, and when would that ever happen? This happens between mothers and daughters who are estranged, between fathers and sons who are estranged, ex-spouses, ex-business associates. This happens a lot. Steve, I haven't talked to my mother in 10 years. She's a narcissist. She's cold. She's withholding. She's a bitch. But she's dying in Indiana. And I don't know whether to go or not. It happens a lot. And the rabbis give us the answer. Ask someone to ask her.
Mhm.
Obviously, someone who doesn't hate her and whom she doesn't hate. Hate is a strong word, but you get the idea. Someone with whom there has been real dysfunction and separation. And that too happens more than you'd imagine. And then, what do you do? Now, this is the next question. The rabbis tell us what you don't do. They said no blessing is required when visiting the sick. Okay, there's no blessing commandment attendant to visiting the sick. So the rabbis tell us what not to do. They don't really tell us what to do. So now I'm going to move away from Talmud, and I'm going to move into, what I personally have learned and what I do. And I've only got a couple minutes, so I'm going to move quickly. So I already told you the two most important things. Show up and be real. Show up and be authentic. Be yourself. Okay? No kabuki. Now, but okay, Steve, what do we actually do? Sometimes, and I learned this visiting my father, sometimes just holding a person's hand. Touch is a language. Touch is a beautiful, powerful language. I would sit for hours next to my dad in his wheelchair in the nursing home and just hold his hand. Another suggestion is I like to take people on a mental vacation. By that, I mean, let's just say for a moment I'm visiting someone in the hospital. I don't know. Okay, Stan, let's play. Unmute. All right, I'm visiting Stan in the hospital, and he's really, and he and Risa have been through a very tough disease together. Some of us know that, but Stan's in the hospital. He's really having a rough go. Could go either way, but he's still Stan, right? So I'm going to take Stan on a mental vacation to let him transcend his own misery for a little while. So Stan, how you doing?
Apprehensive.
Apprehensive. Yeah, well, disease, being here at Cedars like that, I understand. I'm just wondering, can I ask you a couple questions?
Sure, Steve. I've felt pretty isolated here.
Okay, we're going to have some fun, and the kids are going to love hearing this, okay? So do you remember the first second that you saw Risa? Do you remember that?
Yes, absolutely. You can't answer.
Yes. Where was it and when?
It was at a JCC. It was 1963. 1962.
And what JCC? Where was it?
We were in Cleveland, Ohio, my hometown. I was coming home. I came home from HUC and met her.
Oh, so you were already in rabbinical school?
Yes.
And now tell me this. When you first saw her, what was the first thing you thought of? What was the first thought in your mind? Tell the truth.
I have to get her out of this place.
Why?
There was too many people.
Oh, you wanted your own opportunity.
Something like that, yes.
Uh-huh. And
in those days, we would have said, I wanted to hit on her, but I wouldn't use that language now.
Right. What language would you use now?
Oh. I wanted to go for an egalitarian, non-oppressive.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Now, Stan. How about the first kiss? Remember that?
4th of July.
Huh?
4th of July.
Oh, was it? Risa tells me that I remember that it was on the 4th of July.
Yeah. Risa, how was it?
Well, you have to go back to the JCC.
Tell me.
I turned to my brand new roommate. I'd been in Cleveland to start graduate school for a week. And I said, take my car home. I'm going to marry this guy.
Wow.
And this poor simpleton slid into the trap. Yes.
Wow. Okay. Now let's stop. We were all just on a beautiful mental vacation. It was funny. It was romantic. It was beautiful.
It's sweet.
And we're in the hospital.
Right.
We transcended our physical barriers and circumstances. And you know what? Is it a cure? No. Is it a great relief from suffering?
Yes.
Yes. And by the way, everybody learns some things. The kids, if the kids are there, they're like, really? You did? And by the way, I honestly, no hyperbole, I could do this with Stan and Risa for hours. And it will be just as great in the first 5 minutes and just as great in the last 5 minutes. It's all a question of what a person can bear physically and emotionally at that moment. That was 3 minutes, and that's a lot. It could be 30 minutes. This is a beautiful exercise to engage in with people when you're visiting them in the hospital.
Very nice.
It's nice.
Very
So these are kind of the do's and don'ts of Bikur Cholim, of visiting the sick. We do it with our body. We do it with our soul. We do it with our money. We do it in person. We do it from afar. And we do it authentically. We show up as our authentic selves. And in the spirit of Pesach, Dayenu. That is enough, more than enough. Okay, so I want to wish everyone Shabbat Shalom. And I'm on the Bima tonight at Glazer. If you can't be there, I hope you'll be watching. I probably won't see most of you. We're all kind of emerging from the cave, but we're not quite out there yet. I want to wish everybody really a beautiful Pesach. Yes, Barbara.
Shabbat Shalom.
Unmute. Last comment. Yes.
I love you.
Oh.
Sign language.
All right. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shalom.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.